The woman who fired me made one critical mistake. She accidentally handed me her own fake resume. With 15 years in human resources, I could spot fraudulent documents from across the room, and every single reference on her resume was completely fabricated. She had no idea what she had just given me. My name is Marcus Thompson, and for 12 years I'd been the backbone of Meridian Technology Solutions' Human Resources Department. At 42, I had seen 3 chief executive officers come and go, hired over 300 employees, and built the most comprehensive onboarding system the company had ever used. I was good at my job, maybe too good, because when the new human resources director arrived, she made it clear that my methods were outdated. Sarah Mitchell walked into our offices on a Monday morning in September with an impressive resume and an even more impressive attitude. She was 35, carried herself like she owned every room she entered, and spoke about revolutionary human resources practices that would transform our entire department. Within her first week, she had already started questioning every process I had developed over the past decade. The writing was on the wall during our first department meeting. Sarah sat at the head of the conference table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her tablet as she reviewed our current procedures. When she reached the section about employee background verification, she looked directly at me with a condescending smile that made my stomach turn. "Marcus, I appreciate the work you have done here," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they are about to deliver bad news. "But frankly, your approach to verification and reference checking is antiquated. We need to modernize, streamline these processes. The company is moving forward, and unfortunately, some people get left behind." I nodded politely, but inside I was already calculating how much longer I had before she found an excuse to remove me entirely. Sarah had been hired specifically to restructure the department, and restructuring always meant casualties. What I did not expect was how personal she would make it, or how careless she would be about covering her own tracks. The end came on a Friday afternoon, exactly 6 weeks after Sarah had started. She called me into her office, which used to be my office before she arrived, and gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. There was a folder waiting for me, along with a severance package that was suspiciously generous for someone who was supposedly being let go for performance reasons. "Marcus, we need to talk about your future here," Sarah began, not even bothering to look up from her computer screen. "The board has decided that we need fresh perspectives in human resources. Your methods, while thorough, are simply too slow for our current pace of business. We have found someone who can bring the innovation we need." I knew better than to argue. After 15 years in human resources, I had delivered this same speech to dozens of employees. The decision was already made, the paperwork already prepared. Fighting would only make things messier and potentially affect my severance package. Instead, I thanked her for the opportunity, packed my personal items into a cardboard box, and prepared to leave the building for the last time as an employee. That was when Sarah made her first mistake. As I was gathering my things from my desk, Sarah approached with a stack of papers in her hand. She seemed almost friendly now that the difficult conversation was over, like she wanted to end things on a positive note. Maybe she felt guilty about firing someone who had dedicated over a decade to the company, or maybe she was just relieved that I had not caused a scene. "Marcus, before you go, I need you to review these documents," she said, placing the stack on my desk. "Since you know our systems better than anyone, I want to make sure the transition goes smoothly. These are some files I will need your successor to understand." I glanced down at the papers and realized they were human resources documents, including several employee files and what appeared to be administrative records. But there, right on top of the stack, was Sarah Mitchell's own personnel file, complete with her original job application and resume. For a moment, I thought it was an accident, but then I realized she probably wanted me to see how impressive her credentials were. One final reminder of why she was staying and I was leaving. I took the documents home with me, partly because she had asked me to review them, and partly because I was curious about the woman who had just ended my career. That evening, sitting in my home office with a glass of wine, I began going through the files methodically. Most of it was standard human resources paperwork, but when I reached Sarah's resume, something immediately caught my attention. Her work history was impressive, almost too impressive. According to her resume, she'd worked for 3 major corporations over the past 8 years, holding progressively responsible positions in human resources management. Each position showed significant accomplishments, salary increases, and glowing references from supervisors who praised her innovative approaches and leadership skills. But something felt wrong. After 15 years in human resources, you develop an instinct for these things. The formatting was slightly inconsistent between the reference letters. The language patterns were too similar, as if the same person had written all 3 letters but tried to disguise their writing style. Most tellingly, the contact information for the references all used generic email addresses rather than corporate domains. I decided to do what I had done thousands of times during my career: verify the references. I started with the most recent position, a senior human resources manager role at Global Dynamics Corporation. According to her resume, she'd worked there for 3 years and left just before joining our company. The reference letter was signed by someone named David Patterson, who was listed as the Vice President of Human Resources. It took me exactly 20 minutes to discover that David Patterson had never worked for Global Dynamics Corporation. In fact, the email address on the reference letter led to a personal Gmail account that had been created just 6 months ago. When I called Global Dynamics Corporation directly and asked to speak with their Human Resources department, I was told that no one named Sarah Mitchell had ever been employed there. The second reference was even more obviously fake. The company letterhead was a poor reproduction, and the supposed supervisor's LinkedIn profile showed him working for a completely different company during the time period when he allegedly supervised Sarah. By the time I finished checking the third reference, I knew exactly what I was dealing with: a sophisticated fraud who had built her entire career on fake documentation. That was when I started planning my response. Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted the most thorough background investigation of my career. Working from my home office, I used every resource and contact I had built during 15 years in human resources to uncover the truth about Sarah Mitchell. What I discovered was far more extensive than simple resume fraud. Sarah had not just lied about her 3 most recent positions. She had fabricated her entire professional history. The bachelor's degree she claimed from State University was real, but her master's degree in organizational psychology was from a diploma mill that had been shut down by federal authorities 2 years ago. Her professional certifications were either expired or belonged to other people with similar names. But the most damaging discovery came when I started reaching out to my network of human resources professionals across the industry. Through a former colleague who now worked for a background verification company, I learned that Sarah had been flagged in their database as a potential fraud risk. Apparently, she had attempted to use fake references at 2 other companies, but had withdrawn her applications when they requested additional verification. I also discovered something that made my blood run cold. Sarah was not working alone. The fake reference letters and forged documents were too sophisticated for a single person to create. She was connected to a network of individuals who specialized in creating fraudulent employment histories for people trying to break into senior management positions. This was not just someone lying on their resume. This was organized fraud that was defrauding companies out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in salaries and benefits. The more I investigated, the more angry I became. Not just because she had fired me, but because she was stealing opportunities from qualified candidates who had actually earned their positions. Every day she sat in that office, she was making decisions that affected real people's careers and livelihoods, and she had no legitimate right to that authority. I realized I had enough evidence to expose her immediately, but I wanted to be strategic about it. Simply sending an email to the board of directors with my findings might not be enough. Sarah was clearly skilled at talking her way out of difficult situations, and she might find a way to discredit my research or claim that I was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Instead, I decided to use the same methodical approach that had made me successful in human resources for so many years. I would build an airtight case, gather irrefutable evidence, and then present it in a way that would leave no room for doubt or manipulation. Sarah had made the mistake of underestimating someone who understood exactly how employment verification systems worked. I started by creating a detailed timeline of her fraudulent activities, complete with documentation showing the discrepancies in her background. I contacted each of the companies she claimed to have worked for and obtained written statements confirming that she had never been employed there. I even managed to track down some of the real people whose identities she had borrowed for her fake references. But I wanted to do more than just expose her fraud. I wanted to ensure that she could never do this to another company or another employee like me. That meant I needed to be careful about how and when I revealed what I had discovered. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after my termination, I received a phone call that changed everything. The caller introduced himself as James Rodriguez, the Human Resources Director at a major consulting firm downtown. He was calling because Meridian Technology Solutions had been listed as a reference for a candidate they were considering for a senior position. "I am calling to verify the employment of Sarah Mitchell," he said. "According to her application, she currently works as your Human Resources Director and has been there for about 2 months. Can you confirm her employment and provide any insights into her performance?" This was it. This was exactly the opportunity I had been waiting for. Sarah was already interviewing for other positions while still employed at Meridian, which violated her employment contract. More importantly, she was undoubtedly providing the same fake references that I had already debunked. "Actually, I would be very interested in discussing Sarah Mitchell with you," I replied carefully. "But not over the phone. This is a conversation we should have in person, and you're going to want to see some documentation I have regarding her background." We met the following day at a coffee shop halfway between our offices. James was a seasoned human resources professional who immediately understood the implications of what I was showing him. As I walked him through my investigation, his expression grew increasingly serious. By the time I finished, he was already reaching for his phone. "This is exactly the kind of fraud that gives our entire profession a bad reputation," he said, shaking his head. "But Marcus, you realize that you are not the only person who should see this information." If she is defrauding Meridian, and if she has been doing this to other companies, this needs to be reported to the proper authorities. James was right, but I had already thought of that. What I had not told him yet was that I had been in contact with 2 other human resources directors who had similar suspicions about candidates with fraudulent backgrounds. We had started sharing information and had discovered what appeared to be a larger network of individuals using sophisticated fake references to obtain senior positions. Over the next week, James and I worked together to build a comprehensive case against Sarah. He provided additional evidence from her current application, which contained several new fake references that she had not used when applying to Meridian. We also coordinated with the other human resources professionals I had been working with to ensure that we had documentation of the broader fraud network. But the most satisfying part of the plan was how we decided to expose her at Meridian. Rather than simply sending our evidence to the board of directors, we arranged for them to discover Sarah's fraud in the most embarrassing way possible, during a reference check that she did not know was happening. James contacted Meridian's chief executive officer directly and requested a meeting to discuss a significant human resources matter that affected both companies. He did not specify what the meeting was about, only that it was urgent and that Sarah Mitchell should be present. When the chief executive officer asked James to give him some indication of the topic, James simply said that it concerned verification of employment history, and that Sarah would want to be there to represent the company's position. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday morning. Sarah had no idea what was coming. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes when you know justice is about to be served. I was not attending the meeting, but James had agreed to call me immediately afterward to let me know what happened. I spent the morning at home, repeatedly checking my phone and trying to focus on other things, but my mind kept returning to that conference room where Sarah was about to face the consequences of her deception. The call came at 11:30. James sounded both satisfied and slightly shocked by what had transpired. "Marcus, it was even worse than we expected," he began. "When I presented the evidence to the chief executive officer and Sarah, she initially tried to claim that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. She suggested that maybe the companies had lost her employment records, or that there was confusion about dates and job titles. But James had prepared for that response. He had brought copies of the written statements from each company confirming that Sarah had never worked there, along with evidence of the fake email accounts and forged documents. When confronted with irrefutable proof, Sarah's story began to fall apart. The most damaging moment came when I showed them the fake certification documents," James continued. "The chief executive officer recognized the diploma mill immediately because the company had dealt with fraudulent degrees from that same institution before. When he realized that they had hired someone with completely fabricated credentials, his reaction was immediate and decisive. Sarah was terminated on the spot. Security was called to escort her from the building, and the company began the process of reviewing every decision she had made during her brief tenure. But the consequences extended far beyond just losing her job. The evidence James and I had compiled was forwarded to both state and federal authorities who investigate employment fraud. The network of individuals creating fake references was larger than we had initially suspected, and Sarah's case became part of a broader investigation that ultimately led to multiple arrests and prosecutions. Within 6 months, Sarah's name was added to a national database that human resources professionals use to verify candidates and flag potential fraud risks. Her career in human resources was effectively over, and any future employer who conducted proper background verification would immediately discover her history of deception. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was what happened to me. The board of directors at Meridian was so embarrassed by the Sarah Mitchell situation that they conducted a complete review of their hiring processes. They realized that if they had consulted with me before bringing Sarah on board, I would have immediately identified the red flags in her background. 2 weeks after Sarah was fired, I received a call from the Chief Executive Officer asking if I would consider returning to the company in a newly created position. Director of Employment Verification and Background Security. The salary was 30% higher than my previous position, and I would have authority over all hiring decisions, including executive level appointments. I accepted the offer, but with conditions. The company agreed to implement the comprehensive verification procedures I had been advocating for years, and they committed to never again hiring senior management without consulting their internal human resources expertise. On my first day back, I sat in the same office where Sarah had fired me just 4 months earlier. The desk was exactly as I had left it, and ironically, I found myself reviewing the same types of documents that had started this entire situation. Resumes and reference letters from candidates seeking employment. The difference was that now I had the authority and resources to verify every claim, contact every reference, and ensure that what happened with Sarah Mitchell would never happen again. Sometimes the best revenge is not just proving that you were right, being given the power to prevent others from making the same mistakes. As I settled into my new role, I reflected on how a simple act of carelessness, Sarah leaving her own fraudulent resume on my desk, had ultimately led to justice being served. In human resources, we often talk about the importance of attention to detail and thorough verification procedures. Sarah Mitchell learned that lesson the hard way, and I was there to make sure she never forgot it.